The Magic Pages, Favorite Fairy Tales is a wonderful book compiled and illustrated by the talented artist Peter Newell. It brings together some of the best-known and best-loved fairy tales that have been celebrated for generations. From the majestic Jack battling the giants to the romantic Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, and the enigmatic Little Red Riding Hood, each story appeals with its uniqueness and magic. The book also includes stories of the unattractive but kind Ugly Duckling, the beautiful and terrifying Beauty and the Beast, Princess Snow White and the unusual Red Rose. The fabulous wild Swans and Ali Baba and his battle with 40 robbers are not forgotten either. But in addition to the well-known stories, the book also includes 4 others, not as widely known but no less interesting. All these exciting stories, brought to life in the dreams and imagination of children and adults alike, are based on the memories of various famous people who remembered them as their most favorite from childhood. Each page of the book is filled with magic, colorful illustrations, and unforgettable adventures that allow readers to plunge into a world of fairy tales and fascinating stories, opening boundless expanses of imagination and inspiring faith in magic and goodness. Magic Pages, Favorite Tales, is a true treasure trove of fairy tale magic that will
Chapter
never
5
cease to
of
fascinate
Favorite
its
Fairy
readers.
Tales. Chapter 6 of Favorite Fairytales. Favorite Fairytales, compiled and illustrated by Peter Newell. The Ugly Duckling. The country was lovely just then. It was summer. The wheat was golden and the oats still green. The hay was stacked in the rich, low-lying meadows, where the stork was marching about on his long red legs, chattering Egyptian, the language his mother had taught him. Round about field and meadow lay great woods, in the midst of which were deep lakes. Yes, the country certainly was delicious. In the sunniest spot stood an old mansion surrounded by a deep moat, and great dock leaves grew from the walls of the house right down to the water's edge. Some of them were so tall that a small child could stand upright under them. In among the leaves it was as secluded as in the depths of a forest, and there a duck was sitting on her nest. Her little ducklings were just about to be hatched, but she was nearly tired of sitting, for it had lasted such a long time. Moreover, she had very few visitors, as the other ducks liked swimming about in the moat better than waddling up to sit under the dock leaves and gossip with her. At last one egg after another began to crack. "Cheep, cheep," they said. All the chicks had come to life and were poking their heads out. "Quack, quack," said the duck, and then they all quacked their hardest and looked about them on all sides among the green leaves. Their mother allowed them to look as much as they liked, for green is good for the eyes. "How big the world is, to be sure," said all the young ones, for they certainly had ever so much more room to move about than when they were inside the eggshell. "Do you imagine this is the whole world?" said the mother. "It stretches a long way on the other side of the garden, right into the parson's field. But I have never been as far as that. I suppose you are all here now?" And she got up. "No, I declare I have not got you all yet. The biggest egg is still there. How long is it going to last?" And then she settled herself on the nest again. "Well, how are you getting on?" said an old duck who had come to pay her a visit. "This one egg is taking such a long time," answered the sitting duck. "The shell will not crack. But now you must look at the others. They are the finest ducklings I have ever seen. They are all exactly like their father, their rascal. He never comes to see me." "Let me look at the egg which won't crack," said the old duck. "You may be sure that it is a turkey's egg. I have been cheated like that once, and I had no end of trouble and worry with the creatures, for I may tell you that they are afraid of the water. I could not get them into it. I quacked and snapped at them, but it was no good. Let me see the egg. Yes, it is a turkey's egg. You must leave it alone and teach the other children to swim. I will sit a little longer. I have sat so long already that I may as well go on till the midsummer fair comes round." "Please yourself," said the old duck, and she went away. At last the big egg cracked. "Cheep, cheep," said the young one, and tumbled out. How big and ugly he was! The duck looked at him. "That is a monstrous big duckling," she said. "None of the others look like that. Can it be a turkey chick? Well, we shall soon find that out. Into the water you shall go, if I have to kick him in myself." Next day was gloriously fine, and the sun shone on all the green dock leaves. The mother duck with her whole family went down to the moat. Splash into the water she sprang. "Quack, quack," she said, and one duckling plumped in after the other. The water dashed over their heads, but they came up again and floated beautifully. Their legs went off themselves, and they were all there. Even the big ugly grey one swam about with them. "Now, that is no turkey," she said. "See how beautifully he uses his legs, and how erect he holds himself. He is my own chick. After all, he is not so bad when you come to look at him properly. Quack, quack! Now come with me, and I will take you into the world, and introduce you to the duckyard. But keep close to me all the time, so that no one may tread upon you, and beware of the cat." Then they went into the dockyard. There was a fearful uproar going on, for two broods were fighting for the head of an eel, and in the end the cat captured it. "That's how things go in this world," said the mother duck, and she licked her bill, for she wanted the eel's head for herself. "Use your legs," said she. mind you walk properly, and bend your necks to the old duck over there. She is the grandest of them all. She has Spanish blood in her veins, and that accounts for her size, and, do you see? She has a red rag round her leg. That is a wonderfully fine thing, and the most extraordinary mark of distinction any duck can have. It shows clearly that she is not to be parted with, and that she is worthy of recognition both by beasts and men. Quack now! Don't turn your toes in. A well-brought-up duckling keeps his legs wide apart, just like father and mother. That's it. Now bend your necks and say quack. They did as they were bid, but the other ducks round them looked at them and said, quite loud, Just look there. Now we are to have that tribe, just as if there were not enough for us already. And oh dear, how ugly that duckling is! We won't stand him! And a duck flew at him at once and bit him in the neck. Let him be, said the mother. He is doing no harm. Very likely not, but he is so ungainly and queer, said the biter. He must be whacked. They are handsome children mother has, said the old duck with the rag around her leg. All good looking except this one, and he is not a good specimen. It's a pity you can't make him over again. That can't be done, your grace, said the mother duck. He is not handsome, but he is a thorough good creature, and he swims as beautifully as any of the others. Nay, I think I might venture even to add that I think he will improve as he goes on, or perhaps in time he may grow smaller. He was too long in the egg, and so he has not come out with a very good figure. And then she patted his neck and stroked him down. Besides, he is a drake, said she, so it does not matter so much. I believe he will be very strong, and I don't doubt but he will make his way in the world. The other ducklings are very pretty, said the old duck. Now make yourselves quite at home, and if you find the head of an eel, you may bring it to me. After that, they felt quite at home. But the poor duckling, which had been the last to come out of the shell, and who was so ugly, was bitten, pushed about, and made fun of, both by the ducks and the hens. He's too big, they all said, and the turkey-cock, who was born with his spurs on, and therefore thought himself quite an emperor, puffed himself up like a vessel in full sail, made for him, and gobbled till he became quite red in the face. The poor duckling was at his wits' end, and did not know which way to turn. He was in despair because he was so ugly, and the butt of the whole duck-yard. So the first day passed, and afterwards matters grew worse and worse. The poor duckling was chased and hustled by all of them. Even his brothers and sisters ill-used him, and they were always saying, If only the cat would get hold of you, you hideous object. Even his mother said, I wish to goodness you were miles away. The ducks bit him, the hens pecked him, and the girl who fed them kicked him aside. Then he ran off and flew right over the hedge, where the little birds flew up in the air in a fright. That is because I am so ugly, thought the poor duckling, shutting his eyes, but he ran on all the same. Then he came to a great marsh, where the wild ducks lived. He was so tired and miserable that he stayed there the whole night. In the morning, the wild ducks flew up to inspect a new comrade. What sort of creature are you? They inquired, as the duckling turned from side to side and greeted them as well as he could. You're frightfully ugly, said the wild ducks, but that does not matter to us, as long as you do not marry into our family. Poor fellow! He had not thought of marriage. All he wanted was permission to lie among the rushes, and to drink a little of the marsh water. He stayed there 2 whole days. Then 2 wild geese came, or rather 2 wild ganders. They were not long out of the shell, and therefore rather pert. I say, comrade, they said, you are so ugly that we have taken quite a fancy to you. Will you join us and be a bird of passage? There is another marsh close by, and there are some charming wild geese there, old sweet young ladies who can say quack. You are ugly enough to make your fortune among them. Just at that moment, bang, bang, was heard up above, and both the wild geese fell dead among the reeds, and the water turned blood red. Bang, bang, went the guns, and whole flocks of wild geese flew up from the rushes, and the shot peppered among them again. There was a grand shooting party, and the sportsmen lay hidden round the marsh. Some even sat on the branches of trees which overhung the water. The blue smoke rose like clouds among the dark trees and swept over the pool. The water dogs wandered about in the swamp. Splash, splash! The rushes and reeds bent beneath their tread on all sides. It was terribly alarming to the poor duckling. He twisted his head around to get it under his wing, and just at that moment a frightful big dog appeared close beside him. His tongue hung right out of his mouth, and his eyes glared wickedly. He opened his great chasm of a mouth close to the duckling, showed his sharp teeth, and splash! Went on without touching him. "Oh, thank heaven!" sighed the duckling. "I am so ugly that even the dog won't bite me." Then he lay quite still, while the shot whistled among the bushes, and bang after bang rent the air. It only became quiet late in the day, but even then the poor duckling did not dare to get up. He waited several hours more before he looked about, and then he hurried away from the marsh as fast as he could. He ran across fields and meadows, and there was such a wind that he had hard work to make his way. Towards night he reached a poor little cottage. It was such a miserable hovel that it could not make up its mind which way to fall even, and so it remained standing. The wind whistled so fiercely round the duckling that he had to sit on his tail to resist it, and it blew harder and harder. Then he saw that the door had fallen off one hinge, and hung so crookedly that he could creep into the house through the crack, and by this means he made his way into the room. An old woman lived there with her cat and her hen. The cat, what she called Sonny, could arch his back, purr, and give off electric sparks, that is to say, if you struck his fur the wrong way. The hen had quite tiny short legs, and so she was called Chucky Lowlegs. She laid good eggs, and the old woman was as fond of her as if she had been her own child. In the morning the strange duckling was discovered immediately, and the cat began to purr and the hen to cluck. "What on earth is that?" said the old woman, looking round, but her sight was not good, and she thought the duckling was a fat duck which had escaped. "This is a capital find," said she. "Now I shall have duck's eggs, if only it is not a drake. We must find out about that." So she took the duckling on trial for 3 weeks, but no eggs made their appearance. The cat was the master of the house, and the hen the mistress, and they always spoke of "we and the world," for they thought that they represented the half of the world, and that quite a better half. The duckling thought there might be 2 opinions on the subject, but the cat would not hear of it. "Can you lay eggs?" she asked. "No." "Will you have the goodness to hold your tongue then?" And the cat said, "Can you arch your back, purr, and give off sparks?" "No." "Then you had better keep your opinions to yourself when people of sense are speaking." The duckling sat in the corner, nursing his ill humour. Then he began to think of the fresh air and the sunshine. An uncontrollable longing seized him to float on the water, and at last he could not help telling the hen about it. "What on earth possessed you?" she said. "You have nothing to do. That is why you get these freaks into your head. Lay some eggs, or take to purring, and you will get over it." "But it is so delicious to float on the water," said the duckling. "So delicious to feel it rushing over your head when you dive to the bottom." "That would be fine amusement," said the hen. "I think you have gone mad. Ask the cat about it. He is the wisest creature I know. Ask him if he is fond of floating on the water or diving under it. I say nothing about myself. Ask our mistress yourself, the old woman. There is no one in the world cleverer than she is. Do you suppose she has any desire to float on the water or to duck underneath it?" "You do not understand me," said the duckling. "Well, if we don't understand you, who should? I suppose you don't consider yourself cleverer than the cat or the old woman, not to mention me. Don't make a fool of yourself, child, and thank your stars for all the good we have done you. Have you not lived in this warm room, and in such society that you might have learned something? But you are an idiot, and there is no pleasure in associating with you. You may believe me, I mean you well. I tell you home truths, and there is no surer way than that of knowing who are one's friends. You just see about laying some eggs, or learn to purr, or to emit sparks." "I think I will go out into the wide world," said the duckling. "Oh, do so by all means," said the hen. So away went the duckling. He floated on the water, and ducked underneath it, but he was looking askance at by every living creature for his ugliness. Now the autumn came on, the leaves in the woods turned yellow and brown, the wind took hold of them, and they danced about. The sky looked very cold, and the clouds hung heavy with snow and hail. A raven stood on the fence and croaked, "Caw! Caw!" from sheer cold. It made one shiver only to think of it. The poor duckling certainly was in a bad case. One evening the sun was just setting in wintry splendor when a flock of beautifully large birds appeared out of the bushes. The duckling had never seen anything so beautiful. They were dazzlingly white with long waving necks. They were swans, and, uttering a peculiar cry, they spread out their magnificent broad wings and flew away from the cold regions to warmer lands and open seas. They mounted so high, so very high, and the ugly little duckling became strangely uneasy. He circled round and round in the water like a wheel, craning his neck up into the air after them. Then he uttered a shriek so piercing and so strange that he was quite frightened by it himself. Oh, he could not forget those beautiful birds, those happy birds. And as soon as they were out of sight, he ducked right down to the bottom, and when he came up again he was quite beside himself. He did not know what the birds were, or whither they flew, but all the same he was more drawn towards them than he had ever been by any creatures before. He did not even envy them in the least. How could it occur to him to even wish to be such a marvel of beauty? He would have been thankful if only the ducks would have tolerated him among them. The poor ugly creature! The winter was so bitterly cold that the duckling was obliged to swim about in the water to keep it from freezing. But every night the hole in which he swam got smaller and smaller. Then it froze so hard that the surface ice cracked, and the duckling had to use his legs all the time, so that the ice should not close in around him. At last he was so weary that he could move no more, and he was frozen fast into the ice. Early in the morning a peasant came along and saw him. He went out onto the ice and hammered a hole in it with his heavy wooden shoe, and carried the duckling home to his wife. There it soon revived. The children wanted to play with it, but the duckling thought they were going to ill-use him, and rushed in his fright into the milk pan, and the milk spurted out all over the room. The woman shrieked and threw up her hands. Then it flew into the butter cask, and down into the meal tub and out again. Just imagine what it looked like by this time. The woman screamed and tried to hit it with the tongs, and the children tumbled over one another in trying to catch it, and they screamed with laughter. By good luck, the door stood open, and the duckling flew out among the bushes and the new-fallen snow, and it lay there thoroughly exhausted. But it would be too sad to mention all the privation and misery it had to go through during that hard winter. When the sun began to shine warmly again, the duckling was in the marsh, lying among the rushes. The larks were singing, and beautiful spring had come. Then all at once it raised its wings, and they flapped with much greater strength than before, and bore him off vigorously. Before he knew where he was, he found himself in the large garden where the apple trees were in full blossom, and the air was scented with lilacs, the long branches of which overhung the indented shores of the lake. Oh, the spring freshness was so delicious! Just in front of him he saw 3 beautiful white swans advancing towards him from a thicket. With rustling feathers they swam lightly over the water. The duckling recognized the majestic birds, and he was overcome by a strange melancholy. I will fly to them, the royal birds, and they will hack me to pieces because I, who am so ugly, venture to approach them. But it won't matter. Better be killed by them than be snapped at by the ducks, pecked by the hens, or spurned by the henwife, or suffer so much misery in the winter. So he flew into the water and swam towards the stately swans. They saw him and darted towards him with ruffled feathers. "Kill me, oh, kill me," said the poor creature, and bowing his head towards the water, he awaited his death. But what did he see reflected in the transparent water? He saw below him his own image, but he was no longer a clumsy dark grey bird, ugly and ungainly. He was himself a swan. It does not matter in the least having been born in a duckyard, if only you come out of a swan's egg. He felt quite glad of all the misery and tribulation he had gone through. He was the better able to appreciate his good fortune now, and all the beauty which greeted him. The big swans swam round and round him, and stroked him with their bills. Some little children came into the garden with corn and pieces of bread, which they threw into the water, and the smallest one cried out, "There is a new one!" The other children shouted with joy, "Yes, a new one has come!" And they clapped their hands and danced around, running after their father and mother. They threw the bread into the water, and one and all said that the new one was the prettiest. He was so young and handsome. And the old swans bent their heads and did homage before him. He felt quite shy, and hid his head under his wing. He did not know what to think. He was so very happy, but not at all proud. A good heart never becomes proud. He thought of how he had been pursued and scorned, and now he heard them all say that he was the most beautiful of all beautiful birds. The lilacs bent their boards right down into the water before him, and the bright sun was warm and cheering, and he rustled his feathers and raised his slender neck aloft, saying, with exultation in his heart, "I never dreamed of so much happiness when I was the ugly duckling." End of chapter 5.
Chapter 7 of Favorite Fairy Tales. Favorite Fairy Tales. Hop-o' my Thumb. There once lived in a village a faggot maker and his wife who had 7 children, all boys. The eldest was no more than 10 years old, and the youngest was only 7. It was odd enough to be sure that they should have so many children in such a short time, but the truth is the wife always brought him 2 and once 3 at a time. This made him very poor, for not one of these boys was old enough to get a living, and what was still worse, the youngest was a puny little fellow who hardly ever spoke a word. Now this indeed was a mark of his good sense, but it made his father and mother suppose him to be silly, and they thought that at last he would turn out quite a fool. This boy was the least size ever seen, for when he was born he was no bigger than a man's thumb, which made him be christened by the name of Hop-o' my Thumb. The poor child was the drudge of the whole house, and always bore the blame for everything that was done wrong. For all this, Hop-o' my Thumb was far more clever than any of his brothers, and though he spoke but little, he heard and knew more than people thought. It happened just at this time that for want of rain the fields had grown but half as much corn and potatoes as they used to grow, so that the faggot maker and his wife could not give the boys the food they had before, which was always either bread or potatoes. After the father and mother had grieved some time, they thought that as they could not contrive no other way to live, they must somehow get rid of their children. One night, when the boys were gone to bed, and the faggot maker and his wife were sitting over a few lighted sticks to warm themselves, the husband sighed deeply and said, "You see, my dear, we cannot maintain our children any longer, and to see them die of hunger before my eyes is what I could never bear. I will, therefore, tomorrow morning take them to the forest and leave them in the thickest part of it, so that they will not be able to find their way back. This will be very easy, for while they amuse themselves with tying up the faggots, we need only slip away when they are looking some other way." "Ah, husband," cried the poor wife, "you cannot, no, you never can consent to be the death of your own children." The husband in vain told her to think how very poor they were. His wife replied that this was true, but to be sure, but if she was poor, she was still their mother. And then she cried as if her heart would break. At last she thought how shocking it would be to see them starve to death before her eyes, so she agreed to what her husband had said, and then went sobbing to bed. Hop-o' my Thumb had been awake all the time, and when he heard his father talk very seriously, he slipped away from his brother's side, and crept under his father's bed, to hear all that was said without being seen. When his father and mother had left off talking, he went back to his own place and passed the night in thinking what he should do the next morning. He rose early and ran to the river's side, where he filled his pockets with small white pebbles and then went back home. In the morning they all set out as their father and mother had agreed on, and Hop-o'-my-Thumb did not say a word to any of his brothers about what he had heard. They came to a forest that was so very thick that they could not see each other a few yards off. The faggot maker set to work cutting down wood, and the children began to gather the twigs to make faggots of them. When the father and mother saw that the young ones were all very busy, they slipped away without being seen. The children soon found themselves alone and began to cry as loud as they could. Hop-o'-my-Thumb let them cry on, for he knew well enough how to lead them safe home, as he had taken care to drop the white pebbles he had in his pocket all along the way as he had come. He only said to them, "Never mind it, my lads. Father and mother have left us here by ourselves, but only take care to follow me, and I will lead you back again." When they heard this, they left off crying and followed Hop-o'-my-Thumb, who soon brought them to their father's house by the very same path which they had come along. At first, they had not the courage to go in, but stood at the door to hear what their parents were talking about. Just as the faggot maker and his wife had come home without their children, a great gentleman of the village sent to pay them 2 guineas for work they had done for him, which he had owed them so long that they never thought of getting a farthing of it. This money made them quite happy, for the poor creatures were very hungry, and had no other way of getting anything to eat. The faggot maker sent his wife out immediately to buy some meat, and as it was a long time since she had made a hearty meal, she bought as much meat as would have been enough for 6 or 8 persons. The truth was, when she was thinking what it would be enough for dinner, she forgot that her children were not at home. But as soon as she and her husband had done eating, she cried out, "Alas, where are our poor children? How they would have feasted on what we have left! It was all your fault, husband. I told you we should have repented for leaving them out to starve in the forest. Oh mercy, perhaps they have already been eaten by the hungry wolves." The poor woman shed plenty of tears. "Alas, alas," she said over and over again, "what has become of my dear children?" The children, who were all at the door, cried out together, "Here we are, mother, here we are." She flew like lightning to let them in, and kissed every one of them. The faggot maker and his wife were charmed at having their children once more with them, and their joy for this lasted until their money was all spent. But then they found themselves quite as ill off as before. So, by degrees, they again thought of leaving them in the forest, and that the young ones might not come back a second time. They said they would have to take them a great deal further than they did at first. They could not talk about this matter so slyly, but that Hop-o'-my-Thumb found means to hear all that passed between them. But he cared very little about it, for he thought it would be easy for him to do just the same as he had done before. But although he got up very early the next morning to go to the riverside to get the pebbles, a thing which he had not thought of hindered him, for he found the house door was double locked. Hop-o'-my-Thumb was now quite at a loss what to do, but soon after this his mother gave each of the children a piece of bread for breakfast, and then it came into his head that he could make his share do as well as the pebbles by dropping crumbs of it all along the way as he went. So he did not eat his piece, but put it into his pocket. It was not long before they all set out, and their parents took care to lead them into the very thickest and darkest part of the forest. They then slipped away by a bypath as before, and left the children by themselves again. All this did not give Hop-o'-my-Thumb any concern, for he thought himself quite sure of getting back by the means of the crumbs that he had dropped by the way. But when he came to look for them, he found that not a crumb was left, for the birds had eaten them all up. The poor children were now sadly off, for the further they went, the harder it was for them to get out of the forest. At last night came on, and the noise of the wind among the trees seemed to them like a howling of wolves, so that every moment they thought they should be eaten up. They hardly dared to speak a word or to move a limb for fear. Soon after came a heavy rain which wetted them to the very skin and made the ground so slippery that they fell down almost every step and got dirty all over. Before it was quite dark, Hop-o'-my-Thumb climbed up to the top of a tree and looked around on all sides to see if he could find any way of getting help. He saw a small light like that of a candle, but it was a very great way off and beyond the forest. He then came down from the tree to try to find a way to it, but he could not see it when he was on the ground, and he was in the utmost trouble what to do next. They walked on towards the place where he had seen the light, and at last reached the end of the forest, and got sight of it again. They now walked faster, and after being much tired and vexed, for every time they got into lower ground they lost sight of the light, came to the house it was in. They knocked at the door, which was opened by a very poor-natured looking lady, who asked what brought them there. Hop-o'-my-Thumb told her that they were poor children who had lost their way in the forest, and begged that she would give them a bed till morning. When the lady saw that they had such pretty faces, she began to shed tears and said, "Ah, my poor children, you do not know what place you will come to. This is the house of an ogre who eats up little boys and girls." "Alas, madame," replied Hop-o'-my-Thumb, who trembled from head to foot, "what shall we do? If we go back to the forest, we are sure of being torn to pieces by the wolves. We would rather, therefore, be eaten by the gentleman. Besides, when he sees us, perhaps he may take pity on us and spare our lives." The ogre's wife thought she could contrive to hide them from her husband till morning, so she let them go in and warm themselves by a good fire, before which there was a whole sheep roasting for the ogre's supper. When they had stood a short time by the fire, there came a loud knocking at the door. This was the ogre come home. His wife hurried the children under the bed and told them to lie still, and then she went to let her husband in. The ogre asked if supper was ready, and if the wine were fetched from the cellar, and then he sat down at the table. The sheep was not quite done, but he liked it much better half raw. In a minute or two the ogre began to snuff to his right and left, and said he smelt child's flesh. "It must be this calf which has just been killed," said his wife. "I smell child's flesh, I tell thee once more," cried the ogre, looking all about the room. "I smell child's flesh. There is something going on that I do not know of." As soon as he had spoken these words, he rose from his chair and went towards the bed. "Ah, madame," he said, "you thought to cheat me, did you? Wretch, thou art old and tough thyself, or else I would eat thee up too. But come, come, this is lucky enough, for the brats will make a nice dish for 3 ogres, who are my particular friends, and who are to dine with me tomorrow." He then drew them out one by one from under the bed. The poor children fell on their knees and begged his pardon as humbly as they could, but this ogre was the most cruel of all ogres, and instead of feeling any pity, he only began to think how sweet and tender their flesh would be. So he told his wife that they would be nice morsels if she served them with plenty of sauce. He then went and fetched a large knife and began to sharpen it on a long whetstone that he held in his left hand, and all the while he came nearer and nearer to the bed. The ogre took up one of the children and was going to set about cutting him into pieces, but his wife said to him, "What in the world makes you take the trouble of killing them tonight? Will it not be time enough tomorrow morning?" "Hold your prating," cried the ogre. "They will grow tender by being kept a little while after they are killed." "But," said his wife, "you have got so much meat in the house already. Here is the calf, 2 sheep, and half a pig." "True," said the ogre, "so give them all a good supper, that they may not get lean, and send them to bed." The good creature was quite glad at this. She gave them plenty for their supper, but the poor children were so terrified they could not eat a bit. The ogre sat down to his wine, very much pleased with the thought of giving his friends such a dainty dish. This made him drink rather more than common, and he was soon obliged to go to bed himself. Now the ogre had 7 daughters, who were all very young, like Hop-o'-my-Thumb and his brothers. These young ogresses had fair skins, but they fed on raw meat like their father. But they had small grey eyes, quite round and sunk in their heads, hooked noses, wide mouths, and very long, sharp teeth standing a great way off each other. They were too young as yet to do much mischief, but they showed that if they lived to be as old as their father, they would grow quite as cruel as he was, for they took pleasure already in biting young children and sucking their blood. The ogresses had been put to bed very early that night. They were all in one bed, which was very large, and every one of them had a crown of gold on her head. There was another bed of the same size in the room, and in this the ogre's wife put the 7 little boys, and then went to bed herself along with her husband. Now Hop-o'-my-Thumb was afraid that the ogre would wake in the night and kill him and his brothers while they were asleep. So he got out of bed in the middle of the night as softly as he could, took off all his brothers' nightcaps and his own, and crept with them to the bed that the ogre's daughters were in. He then took off their crowns and put the nightcaps on their heads instead. Next he put the crowns on his brothers' heads and his own, and got into bed again, expecting after this that if the ogre should come, he would take him and his brothers for his own children. Everything turned out as he wished. The ogre waked soon after midnight and began to be very sorry that he had put off killing the boys till the morning. So he jumped out of bed and took hold of his large knife. "Let us see," said he, "what the young rogues are about, and do business at once." He touched their heads one at a time, and feeling the crowns of gold, he said to himself, Oh, I had like to have made such a mistake. I must have drunk too much wine last night." He went next to the bed that his own little ogresses were in, and when he felt the nightcaps, he said, "Ah, here you are, my lads." And so in a moment he had cut the throats of all his daughters. He was very much pleased when he had done this, and then went back to his own bed. As soon as Hop-o'-my-Thumb heard him snore, he awoke his brothers and told them to put on their clothes quickly and follow him. They stole down softly into the garden, and then jumped from the wall into the road. They ran as fast as their legs could carry them, but were so much afraid all the while that they hardly knew which way to take. When the ogre waked in the morning, he said to his wife, grinning, "My dear, go and dress the young rogues I saw last night." The wife was quite surprised at hearing her husband speak so kindly, and did not dream of the real meaning of his words. She supposed he wanted her to help them put their clothes on, so she went upstairs, and the first thing she saw was her 7 daughters with their throats cut and all over blood. This threw her into a fainting fit. The ogre was afraid his wife might be too long in doing what he had set her about, so he went himself to help her. But he was as much shocked as she had been at the dreadful sight of his bleeding children. "Ah, what have I done?" he cried. "But the little rascals shall pay for it, I warrant them." He first threw some water on his wife's face, and as soon as she came to herself, he said to her, "Bring me quickly my 7-league boots, that I may go and catch the little vipers." The ogre then put on these boots and set out with all speed. He strided over many parts of the country, and at last turned into the very road in which the poor children were, for they had set off towards the faggot-maker's cottage, which they had almost reached. They watched the ogre stepping from the mountain to mountain at one step, and crossing rivers as if they had been tiny brooks. At this, Hop-o'-my-Thumb thought a little what was to be done, and spying a hollow place under a large rock, he made his brothers get into it. He then crept in himself, but kept his eyes fixed on the ogre to see what he would do next. The ogre found himself quite weary with the journey he had gone, for 7-league boots are very tiresome to the person who wears them. So he now began to think of resting, and it happened to sit down on the very rock where the poor children were hid. As he was so tired, and it was a hot day, he fell fast asleep, and soon began to snore so loud that the little fellows were terrified. When Hop o' My Thumb saw this, he said to his brothers, "Courage, my lads, never fear. You have nothing to do but to steal away and get home while the ogre is fast asleep, and leave me to shift for myself." The brothers now were very glad to do whatever he told them, and so they soon came to their father's house. In the meantime, Hop o' My Thumb went up to the ogre softly, pulled off his 7-league boots very gently, and put them on his own legs, for though the boots were very large, yet being fairy boots, they could make themselves small enough to fit on any leg they pleased. As soon as ever Hop o' My Thumb had made sure of the ogre's 7-league boots, he went at once to the palace and offered his services to carry orders from the king to his army, which was a great way off, and to carry back the quickest accounts of the battle they were just at that time fighting with the enemy. In short, he thought he could be of more use to the king than all his male coaches, and so should make his fortune in this manner. He succeeded so well that in a short time he made money enough to keep himself, his father and mother, and 6 brothers without the trouble of working for the rest of their lives. Having done this, he went back to his father's cottage, where all the family were delighted to see him again. As the great fame of his boots had been talked of at court in this time, the king sent for him, and indeed employed him very often in the greatest affairs of the state, so that he became one of the richest men in the kingdom. And now let us see what became of the wicked ogre. He slept so soundly that he never discovered the loss of his boots, but having an evil conscience and bad dreams, he fell in his sleep from the corner of the rock where Hop o' My Thumb and his brothers had left him, and bruised himself so much from head to foot that he could not stir. So he was forced to stretch himself out at full length and wait for someone to come and help him. Now a good many faggot makers passed near the place where the ogre lay, and when they heard him groan, they went up and asked him what was the matter. But the ogre had eaten such a great number of children in his lifetime that he had grown so very big and fat that these men could not even have carried one of his legs, so they were forced to leave him there. At last night came on, and a large serpent came out of a wood just by and stung him so that he died in great pain. By and by, Hop o' My Thumb, who had become the king's first favorite, heard of the ogre's death, and the first thing he did was to tell his majesty all that the good-natured ogress had done to save the lives of himself and his brothers. The king was so much pleased at what he heard that he asked Hop o' My Thumb if there was any favor he could do to bestow upon her. Hop o' My Thumb thanked the king, and desired that the ogress might have the noble title of Duchess of Draggletail given to her, which was no sooner asked than granted. The ogress then came to court and lived very happily for many years, enjoying the vast fortune she had found in the ogre's chests. As for Hop o' My Thumb, he every day grew more witty and brave, till at last the king made him the greatest lord in the kingdom, and set him over all his affairs. End of Chapter 7.
Chapter 8 of Favorite Fairy Tales. Favorite Fairy Tales. Beauty and the Beast. There was once a very rich merchant who had 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls. As he was himself a man of great sense, he spared no expense for their education. The 3 daughters were all handsome, but particularly the youngest. Indeed, she was so very beautiful that in her childhood everyone called her the Little Beauty, and being equally lovely when she was grown up, nobody called her by any other name, which made her sisters very jealous of her. This youngest daughter was not only more handsome than her sisters, but also was better tempered. The 2 eldest were vain of their wealth and position. They gave themselves 1,000 airs, and refused to visit other merchants' daughters, nor would they condescend to be seen except with persons of quality. They went every day to balls, plays, and public walks, and always made game of their youngest sister for spending her time in reading or other useful employments. As it was well known that these young ladies would have large fortunes, many great merchants wished to get them for wives. But the 2 eldest always answered that, for their parts, they had no thoughts of marrying anyone below a duke or an earl at least. Beauty had quite as many offers as her sisters, but she always answered, with the greatest civility, that though she was much obliged to her lovers, she would rather live some years longer with her father, as she thought herself too young to marry. It happened that, by some unlucky accident, the merchant suddenly lost all his fortune, and had nothing left but a small cottage in the country. Upon this he said to his daughters, while the tears ran down his cheeks, "My children, we must now go and dwell in the cottage, and try to get a living by labor, for we have no other means of support." The two eldest replied that they did not know how to work, and would not leave town, for they had lovers enough who would be glad to marry them, though they had no longer any fortune. But in this they were mistaken, for when the lovers heard what had happened, they said, "The girls were so proud and ill-tempered that all we wanted was their fortune. We are not sorry at all to see their pride brought down. Let them show off their heirs to their cows and sheep." But everybody pitied poor Beauty, because she was so sweet-tempered and kind to all, and several gentlemen offered to marry her, though she had not a penny. But Beauty still refused, and said she could not think of leaving her poor father in this trouble. At first Beauty could not help sometimes crying in secret for the hardships she was now obliged to suffer. But in a very short time she said to herself, "All the crying in the world will do me no good, so I will try to be happy without a fortune." When they had removed to their cottage, the merchant and his 3 sons employed themselves in ploughing and sowing the fields, and working in the garden. Beauty also did her part, for she rose by 4 o'clock every morning, lighted the fires, cleaned the house, and got ready the breakfast for the whole family. At first she found all this very hard, but she soon grew quite used to it, and thought it no hardship. Indeed, the work greatly benefited her health. When she had done, she used to amuse herself with reading, playing her music, or singing while she spun. But her 2 sisters were at a loss what to do to pass the time away. They had their breakfast in bed, and did not rise till 10 o'clock. Then they commonly walked out, but always found themselves very soon tired, when they would often sit down under a shady tree, and grieved for the loss of their carriage and fine clothes, and say to each other, "What a mean-spirited, poor, stupid creature our young sister is, to be so content with this low way of life." But their father thought differently, and loved and admired his youngest child more than ever. After they had lived in this manner about a year, the merchant received a letter which informed him that one of his richest ships, which he thought was lost, had just come into port. This news made the 2 eldest sisters almost mad with joy, for they thought they should now leave the cottage and have all their finery again. When they found that their father must take a journey to the ship, the 2 eldest begged he would not fail to bring them back some new gowns, caps, rings, and all sorts of trinkets. But Beauty asked for nothing, for she thought in herself that all the ship was worth would hardly buy everything her sisters wished for. "Beauty," said the merchant, "how comes it that you ask for nothing? What can I bring you, my child?" "Since you are so kind as to think of me, dear father," she answered, "I should be glad if you would bring me a rose, for we have none in our garden." Now, Beauty did not indeed wish for a rose, nor anything else, but she only said this that she might not affront her sisters. Otherwise they would have said she wanted her father to praise her for desiring nothing. The merchant took his leave of them, and set out on his journey. But when he got to the ship, some persons went to law with him about the cargo, and after a deal of trouble he came back to his cottage as poor as he had left it. When he was within 30 miles of his home, and thinking of the joy of again meeting his children, he lost his way in the midst of a dense forest. It rained and snowed very hard, and besides, the wind was so high as to throw him twice from his horse. Night came on, and he feared he should die of cold and hunger, or be torn to pieces by the wolves that he heard howling around him. All at once he cast his eyes towards a long avenue, and saw at the end a light, but it seemed a great way off. He made the best of his way towards it, and found that it came from a splendid palace, the windows of which were all blazing with light. It had great bronze gates, standing wide open, and fine courtyards, through which the merchant passed, but not a living soul was to be seen. There were stables too, which his poor, starved horse, less scrupulous than himself, entered at once, and took a good meal of oats and hay. His master then tied him up, and walked towards the entrance hall, but still without seeing a single creature. He went on to a large dining parlour, where he found a good fire, and a table covered with some very nice dishes, but only one plate with a knife and fork. As the snow and rain had wetted him to the skin, he went up to the fire to dry himself. "I hope," said he, "the master of the house or his servants will excuse me, for it surely will not be long now before I see them." He waited some time, but still nobody came. At last the clock struck 11, and the merchant, being quite faint for the want of food, helped himself to a chicken and to a few glasses of wine, yet all the time trembling with fear. He sat till the clock struck 12, and then, taking courage, began to think he might as well look about him. So he opened a door at the end of the hall, and went through it into a very grand room, in which there was a fine bed, and as he was feeling very weary, he shut the door, took off his clothes, and got into it. It was 10 o'clock in the morning before he awoke, when he was amazed to see a handsome new suit of clothes lay ready for him, instead of his own, which were all torn and spoiled. "To be sure," said he to himself, "this place belongs to some good fairy, who has taken pity on my ill luck." He looked out the window, and instead of the snow-covered wood, where he had lost himself the previous night, he saw the most charming arbours covered with all kinds of flowers. Returning to the hall where he had supped, he found a breakfast table ready prepared. "Indeed, my good fairy," said the merchant aloud, "I am vastly obliged to you for your kind care of me." He then made a hearty breakfast, took his hat, and was going to the stable to pay his horse a visit, but as he passed under one of the harbours, which was loaded with roses, he thought of what Beauty had asked him to bring back to her, and so he took a bunch of roses to carry home. At the same moment he heard a loud noise, and saw coming towards him a beast so frightful to look at that he was ready to faint with fear. "Ungrateful man," said the beast in a terrible voice, "I have saved your life by admitting you into my palace, and in return you steal my roses, which I value more than anything I possess. But you shall atone for your fault. You shall die in a quarter of an hour." The merchant fell on his knees, and clasping his hand said, "Sir, I humbly beg your pardon. I did not think it would offend you to gather a rose for one of my daughters, who had entreated me to bring her one home. Do not kill me, my lord." "I am not a lord, but a beast," replied the monster. "I hate false compliments, so do not fancy that you can coax me by any such means. You tell me that you have daughters. Now I will suffer you to escape, if one of them will come and die in your stead. If not, promise that you will yourself return in 3 months, to be dealt with as I may choose." The tender-hearted merchant had no thoughts of letting any one of his daughters die for his sake, but he knew that if he seemed to accept the beast's terms, he should at least have the pleasure of seeing them once again. So he gave his promise, and was told he might set off as soon as he liked. "But," said the beast, "I do not wish you to go back empty-handed. Go to the room you slept in, and you will find a chest there. Fill it with whatsoever you like best, and I will have it taken to your own house for you." When the beast had said this, he went away. The good merchant, left to himself, began to consider that as he must die, for he had no thought of breaking a promise made even to a beast, he might as well have the comfort of leaving his children provided for. He returned to the room he had slept in, and found there heaps of gold pieces laying about. He filled the chest with them to the very brim, locked it, and mounting his horse, left the palace, as sorrowful as he had been glad when he first beheld it. The horse took a path across the forest of his own accord, and in a few hours they reached the merchant's house. His children came running round him, but instead of kissing them with joy, he could not help weeping as he looked at them. He held in his hand the bunch of roses, which he gave to Beauty, saying, "Take these roses, Beauty, but little do you think how dear they have cost your poor father." And then he gave them an account of all that he had seen or heard in the palace of the Beast. The two eldest sisters now began to shed tears, and to lay the blame upon Beauty, who, they said, would be the cause of her father's death. "See," said they, "what happens from the pride of the little wretch. Why did she not ask for such things as we did? But to be sure, Miss must not be like other people, and though she will be the cause of her father's death, yet she does not shed a tear." "It would be useless," replied Beauty, "for father shall not die. As the Beast will accept one of his daughters, I will give myself up, and be only too happy to prove my love for the best of fathers." "No, sister," said the three brothers with one voice, "that cannot be. We will go in search of this monster, and either he or we will perish." "Do not hope to kill him," said the merchant. "His power is far too great. But Beauty's young life shall not be sacrificed. I am old and cannot expect to live much longer, so I shall but give up a few years of my life, and shall only grieve for the sake of my children." "Never, father," cried Beauty. "If you go back to the palace, you cannot hinder my going after you. Though young, I am not over fond of life, and I would much rather be eaten up by the monster than die of grief for your loss." The merchant in vain tried to reason with Beauty, who still obstinately kept to her purpose, which in truth made her two sisters glad, for they were jealous of her because everybody loved her. The merchant was so grieved at the thoughts of losing his child that he never once thought of the chest filled with gold. But at night, to his great surprise, he found it standing by his bedside. He said nothing about his riches to his eldest daughters, for he knew very well it would at once make them want to return to town. But he told Beauty his secret, and she then said that while he was away, two gentlemen had been on a visit at their cottage who had fallen in love with her two sisters. She entreated her father to marry them without delay, for she was so sweet-natured she only wished them to be happy. 3 months went by only too fast, and then the merchant and Beauty got ready to set out for the palace of the Beast. Upon this, the two sisters rubbed their eyes with an onion to make believe that they were crying. Both the merchant and his sons cried in earnest. Only Beauty shed no tears. They reached the palace in a very few hours, and the horse, without bidding, went into the same stable as before. The merchant and Beauty walked towards the large hall, where they found a table covered with every dainty and 2 plates laid ready. The merchant had very little appetite, but Beauty, that she might the better hide her grief, placed herself at the table and helped her father. Then she began to eat herself, and thought all the time that, to be sure, the Beast had a mind to fatten her before he ate her up, since he had provided such good cheer for her. When they had done their supper, they heard a great noise, and the good old man began to bid his poor child farewell, for he knew it was the Beast coming to them. When Beauty first saw that frightful form, she was very much terrified, but tried to hide her fear. The creature walked up to her and eyed her all over, then asked her, in a dreadful voice, if she had come quite of her own accord. "Yes," said Beauty. "Then you are a good girl, and I am very much obliged to you." This was such an astonishingly civil answer that Beauty's courage rose. But it sank again when the Beast, addressing the merchant, desired him to leave the palace next morning and never return to it again. And so good night, merchant, and good night, Beauty. "Good night, Beast," she answered, as the monster shuffled out of the room. "Ah, my dear child," said the merchant, kissing his daughter, "I am half dead already at the thought of leaving you with this dreadful Beast. You shall go back and let me stay in your place." "No," said Beauty boldly. "I will never agree to that. You must go home tomorrow morning." Then they wished each other good night and went to bed, both of them thinking they should not be able to close their eyes. But as soon as ever they had laid down, they fell into a deep sleep, and did not awake till morning. Beauty dreamed that a lady came up to her and said, "I am very much pleased, Beauty, with the goodness you have shown, in being willing to give your life to save that of your father. Do not be afraid of anything. You shall not go without a reward." As soon as Beauty awoke, she told her father this dream, but though it gave him some comfort, it was a long time before he could be persuaded to leave the palace. At last Beauty succeeded in getting him safely away. When her father was out of sight, poor Beauty began to weep sorrowfully. Still, having naturally a courageous spirit, she soon resolved not to make her sad case still worse by sorrow, which she knew was vain, but to wait and be patient. She walked about to take a view of all the palace, and the elegance of every part of it much charmed her. But what was her surprise when she came to a door on which was written, "Beauty's Room." She opened it in haste, and her eyes were dazzled by the splendor and taste of the apartment. What made her wonder more than all the rest was a large library filled with books, a harpsichord, and many pieces of music. "The beast surely does not mean to eat me up immediately," said she. "Since he takes care I shall not be at a loss how to amuse myself." She opened the library and saw these verses written in letters of gold on the back of one of the books. "Beauteous lady, dry your tears. Here's no cause for sighs or fears. Command as freely as you may, for your command and I obey." "Alas," said she, sighing, "I wish I could only command a sight of my poor father, and to know what he is doing at this moment." Just then, by chance, she cast her eyes on a looking-glass that stood near her, and in it she saw a picture of her old home and her father riding mournfully up to the door. Her sisters came out to meet him, and although they tried to look sorry, it was easy to see that in their hearts they were very glad. In a short time all this picture disappeared, but it caused Beauty to think that the beast, besides being very powerful, was also very kind. About the middle of the day she found a table laid ready for her, and a sweet concert of music played all the time she was dining, without her seeing anybody. But at supper, when she was going to seat herself at table, she heard the noise of the beast, and could not help trembling with fear. "Beauty," said he, "will you give me leave to see you sup?" "That is as you please," answered she, very much afraid. "Not in the least," said the beast. "You alone command in this palace. If you should not like my company, you need only say so, and I will leave you that moment. But tell me, Beauty, do you not think me very ugly?" "Why, yes," said she, "for I cannot tell a falsehood. But then I think you are very good." "Am I?" sadly replied the beast. "Yet, besides being ugly, I am also very stupid. I know well enough that I am but a beast." "Very stupid people," said Beauty, "are never aware of it themselves." At which kindly speech the beast looked pleased, and replied, not without an awkward sort of politeness, "Pray, do not let me detain you from supper, and be sure that you are well served. All you see is your own, and I should be deeply grieved if you wanted for anything. You are very kind, so kind that I almost forgot you are so ugly," said Beauty earnestly. "Ah, yes," answered the beast with a great sigh. "I hope I am good-tempered, but still I am only a monster." There is many a monster who wears the form of a man. It is better of the two to have the heart of a man and the form of a monster. "I would thank you, Beauty, for this speech, but I am too senseless to say anything that would please you," returned the beast in a melancholy voice, and altogether he seemed so gentle and so unhappy that Beauty, who had the tenderest heart in the world, felt her fear for him gradually vanish. She ate her supper with a good appetite, and conversed in her own sensible and charming way, till at last, when the Beast rose to depart, he terrified her more than ever by saying abruptly in his gruff voice, "Beauty, will you marry me?" Now, Beauty, frightened as she was, would speak only the exact truth. Besides, her father had told her that the Beast liked only to have the truth spoken to him. So she answered in a very firm tone, "No, Beast." He did not go into a passion or do anything, but sigh deeply and depart. When Beauty found herself alone, she began to feel pity for the poor Beast. "Oh," said she, "what a sad thing it is that he should be so very frightful, since he is so good-tempered." Beauty lived 3 months in this palace very well pleased. The Beast came to see her every night, and talked with her while she supped, and though what he said was not very clever, yet, as she saw in him every day some new goodness, instead of dreading the time of his coming, she soon began continually looking at her watch to see if it were 9 o'clock, for that was the hour when he never failed to visit her. One thing only vexed her, which was that every night, before he went away, he always made it a rule to ask her if she would be his wife, and seemed very much grieved at her steadfastly replying no. At last one night she said to him, "You wound me greatly, Beast, by forcing me to refuse you so often. I wish I could take such a liking to you as to agree to marry you, but I must tell you plainly that I do not think it will ever happen. I shall always be your friend, so try to let that content you." "I must," sighed the Beast, "for I know well enough how frightful I am, but I love you better than myself. Yet I think I am very lucky in your being pleased to stay with me. Now promise me, Beauty, that you will never leave me." Beauty would almost have agreed to this, so sorry was she for him, but she had that day seen in her magic glass, which she looked at constantly, that her father was dying of grief for her sake. "Alas," she said, "I long so much to see my father, that if you do not give me leave to visit him, I shall break my heart." "I would rather break mine, Beauty," answered the Beast. "I will send you to your father's cottage. You shall stay there, and your poor Beast shall die of sorrow." "No," said Beauty, crying, "I love you too well to be the cause of your death. I promise to return in a week. You have shown me that my sisters are married, and my brothers are gone for soldiers, so that my father is left all alone. Let me stay a week with him." "You shall find yourself with him tomorrow morning," replied the Beast. "But mind, do not forget your promise. When you wish to return, you have nothing to do but to put your ring on a table when you go to bed. Goodbye, Beauty." The Beast sighed as he said these words, and Beauty went to bed very sorry to see him so much grieved. When she awoke in the morning, she found herself in her father's cottage. She rang a bell that was at her bedside, and a servant entered. But as soon as she saw Beauty, the woman gave a loud shriek, upon which the merchant ran upstairs, and when he beheld his daughter, he ran to her and kissed her 100 times. At last Beauty began to remember that she had brought no clothes with her to put on, but the servant told her she had just found in the next room a large chest full of dresses, trimmed all over with gold and adorned with pearls and diamonds. Beauty, in her own mind, thanked the Beast for his kindness, and put on the plainest gown she could find among them all. She then desired the servant to lay the rest aside, for she intended to give them to her sisters. But as soon as she had spoken these words, the chest was gone out of sight in a moment. Her father then suggested perhaps the Beast chose for her to keep them all for herself, and as soon as he had said this, they saw the chest standing again in the same place. While Beauty was dressing herself, her servant brought word to her that her sisters were come with their husbands to pay her a visit. They both lived unhappily with the gentleman they had married. The husband of the eldest was very handsome, but was so proud of this that he thought of nothing else from morning till night, and did not care a pin for the beauty of his wife. The second had married a man of great learning, but he made no use of it, except to torment and affront all his friends and his wife more than any of them. The two sisters were ready to burst with spite when they saw Beauty dressed like a princess and looking so very charming. All the kindness that she showed them was of no use, for they were vexed more than ever when she told them how happy she lived at the palace of the Beast. The spiteful creatures went by themselves into the garden, where they cried to think of her good fortune. "Why should the little wretch be better off than we?" said they. "We are much handsomer than she is." "Sister," said the eldest, "a thought has just come into my head. Let us try to keep her here longer than the week for which the Beast gave her leave, and then he will be so angry that perhaps when she goes back to him he will eat her up in a moment." "That is well thought of," answered the other, "but to do this we must pretend to be very kind." They then went to join her in the cottage, where they showed her so much false love that Beauty could not help crying for joy. When the week was ended, the two sisters began to pretend such grief at the thought of her leaving them that she agreed to stay a week more. But all that time Beauty could not help fretting for her sorrow that she knew her absence would grieve her poor Beast, for she tenderly loved him and much wished for his company again. Among all the grand and clever people she saw, she found nobody who was half so sensible, so affectionate, so thoughtful, or so kind. The 10th night of her being at the cottage, she dreamed she was in the garden of the palace, that the Beast lay dying on a grass plot, and with his last breath put her in mind of her promise, and laid his death to her forsaking him. Beauty awoke in a great fright, and burst into tears. "Am not I wicked," said she, "to behave so ill to a Beast who has shown me so much kindness? Why will I not marry him? I am sure I should be more happy with him than my sisters are with their husbands. He shall not be wretched any longer on my account, for I should do nothing but blame myself all the rest of my life." She then rose, put her ring on her table, got into bed again, and soon fell asleep. In the morning, she with joy found herself in the palace of the Beast. She dressed herself very carefully, that she might please him the better, and thought she had never known a day pass away so slowly. At last the clock struck 9, but the Beast did not come. Beauty, dreading lest she might truly have caused his death, ran from room to room, calling out, "Beast, dear Beast!" But there was no answer. At last she remembered her dream, rushed to the grass plot, and there saw him lying, apparently dead beside the fountain. Forgetting all his ugliness, she threw herself upon his body, and finding his heart still beat, she fetched some water and sprinkled it over him, weeping and sobbing the while. The Beast opened his eyes. "You forgot your promise, Beauty, and so I determined to die, for I could not live without you. I have starved myself to death, but I shall die content, since I have seen your face once more." "No, dear Beast," cried Beauty passionately, "you shall not die. You shall live to be my husband. I thought it was only friendship I felt for you, but now I know it was love." The moment Beauty had spoken these words, the palace was suddenly lighted up, and all kinds of rejoicings were heard around them, none of which she noticed, but hung over her dear Beast with the utmost tenderness. At last, unable to refrain herself, she dropped her head over her hands, covered her eyes, and cried for joy. And when she looked up again, the Beast was gone. In his stead, she saw at her feet a handsome, graceful young prince, who thanked her with the tenderest expression for having freed him from enchantment. "But where is my poor Beast? I only want him and nobody else," sobbed Beauty. "I am he," replied the prince. "A wicked fairy condemned me to this form, and forbade me to show that I had any wit or sense, till a beautiful lady should consent to marry me. You alone, dearest Beauty, judged me neither by my looks nor by my talents, but by my heart alone. Take it then, and all that I have besides, for all is yours." Beauty, full of surprise, but very happy, suffered the prince to lead her to his palace, where she found her father and sisters, who had been brought there by the fairy lady whom she had seen in a dream the first night she came. "Beauty," said the fairy, "you have chosen well, and you have your reward, for a true heart is better than either good looks or clever brains. As for you, ladies," and she turned to the two elder sisters, "I know all your ill deeds, but I have no worse punishment for you than to see your sister happy. You shall stand as statues at the door of her palace, and when you repent of and have amended your faults, you shall become women again. But to tell you the truth, I very much fear you will remain statues forever." End of Beauty and the Beast. Recording by Sandra Luna.